What's up guys, welcome back. This is Anime Fiction. You'll be watching What If Naruto Became the Living Myth of Los Santos Part 7. Now, let's begin. The Buffalo STX purred down palm-lined streets of pristine Rockford Hills. The air here didn't smell like the salt of the Pacific, or the thick smog of East Los Santos. It smelled of manicured lawns, hot imported asphalt, and aggressive, insulated wealth. Naruto pulled his black muscle car up across the street from Record A Studios. It was a sleek modern fortress of glass and steel, built as an exclusive sanctuary for the city's most high-profile musicians. Now, Sanctuary was completely compromised. 3 heavy blacked-out SUVs were parked haphazardly across the VIP loading zone, completely blocking off the entrance to the private garage. 5 men in sharp, tailored suits leaned against the cars. They didn't openly carry guns, but the rigid posture and the bulky bulges under their jackets were the unmistakable trademarks of professional fixers. Naruto left the STX. The neighborhood was quiet. The only sounds were the distant drone of the motors of rich men and the rustle of wind through the palm fronds. Franklin stood by the glass doors of the studio. His jaw was clenched in frustration as he argued with the lead fixer, a broad-shouldered man with a Bluetooth earpiece and a condescending smirk. "It's a public street, man," the fixer was saying, his voice carrying easily to the sidewalk. "My clients like the view. If Dr. Dre's entourage can't get their cars in the bay, maybe they should find a studio with better parking. I heard Vinewood Boulevard has some great amateur booths." Naruto crossed the street, his boots making no sound against the pavement. He didn't care about music producers or rival record labels or the egos of Vinewood stars. But Franklin was the physical buffer between the agency and the chaos on street level. And the agency protected Naruto's subterranean safe house. If Franklin's network went down, the noise would eventually reach the Vinewood Hills. "Franklin," Naruto said softly. Franklin turned and relief flickered across his drawn face. "Naruto. We have a situation. These are guys from a rival label. They're trying to take away our VIP bookings by not letting us into the studio. I can't just take them out on camera in the middle of Rockford Hills. The heat would destroy the business." The lead fixer looked Naruto up and down, his smirk turning into a sneer. He looked at the plain white t-shirt and the dark sweatpants. "This is your backup, Clinton. A child. What's he gonna do, key my paint job?" Naruto didn't copy the man's aggressive posture. He stopped 2 feet away from the lead fixer, his hands in his pockets. The man smelled of spicy, pricey cologne and the light bitter tang of electronic cigarette smoke. Naruto said, "Move the cars." His voice held no trace of anger or of posturing, only smoothness. It had that heavy, unnatural gravity that seemed to physically squeeze the air out of the space between them. The fixer sneered and advanced, using his bulk to intimidate the teenager. "Or what, kid? You calling the police? We are allowed. We keep counsel. You touch me and you go to jail for assault." Naruto didn't create a big shockwave by flashing his chakra. He didn't even have to break the glass in the studio or alert the neighborhood patrols of private security. Instead he directed a pinpoint, crushing wave of pure killing intent directly into the man's nervous system. The temperature around them seemed to drop at once. The smirk left the fixer's face. Suddenly his primitive, instinctual brain recognized that the teenager in front of him was not some street thug or rival corporate suit. He was an apex predator, and the chasm between their physical realities was absolute and unbridgeable. The man's breath caught in his throat. He tried to take a step back, but his legs went numb all of a sudden. The other 4 fixers by the SUVs shifted uneasily, the suffocating pressure bleeding from them like it was a physical weight. Naruto reached out, hand moving fast enough that it didn't even register in the man's visual processing. He pressed his palm flat against the hood of the big, armored SUV the man had been leaning on. Naruto shoved a tiny, insanely dense burst of chakra right into the metal. The reinforced steel screeched violently and agonizingly as it folded inward, spider-webbing the bulletproof windshield and crushing the engine block beneath it completely. The big vehicle sagged, its front suspension collapsing under the impossible localized pressure. Naruto didn't even flinch. He let his hand fall and looked again at the frightened fixer. "I'm not calling the cops," Naruto said in a quiet voice, "and I ain't gonna punch ya. But if these cars aren't gone in 30 seconds, I walk through the rest of them. And then I'll find out who paid you to park here and I'll go through their building too." The crushing, freezing pressure was gone as suddenly as it had come. The lead fixer fell back, his face white as a sheet. He stared at the ruined, smoking hood of the armored SUV, his mind refusing to process how a teenager had destroyed a V8 engine block with an open palm. "Get in the cars," the man choked, his voice quavering as he waved his crew frantically. "Get in the cars, we're leaving." The fixers scrambled into the two SUVs remaining intact. The lead guy dove into the driver's seat of the wreck, frantically turning the ignition. Miraculously, the crippled engine sputtered into life, grinding horribly as it reversed off the curb and sped away down the pristine avenue, leaking a trail of black oil onto the expensive asphalt. The street was quiet again. Franklin sighed heavily, running a hand over his face, looking down at the oil stain on the street. "Man, I was prepared to spend the next 3 days fighting them in court just to get a tow truck in here. The street's clear." Naruto turned back to his Buffalo STX, smoothly. The threat to his ecosystem was averted. "Let your client know loading zone is open." Dax's frantic voice echoed through the Vinewood Safehouse's primary communications speaker, breaking the subterranean silence. "I'm telling you, Mutt, if you let those leather-clad, unwashed cavemen touch my pristine chemical vats, I'll personally feed you to a mountain lion. Ram them. Run them over." Naruto entered the command center, holding a half-eaten cup of instant ramen. He wasn't wearing his tailored black suits or the rigid, unconcerned expression he reserved for cartel bosses and billionaires. He wore a simple, bright orange and black track jacket, with his blonde hair sticking up in its usual, messy spikes. He swallowed his noodles and muted Dax's feed. "Amani, why is Dax yelling over my ramen?" Amani sighed and rubbed the bridge of her nose under her glasses. "The acid lab is currently under siege." Mutt was running a massive resupply through the Grand Senora Desert when a rogue chapter of the Lost MC decided they needed a new mobile clubhouse. They boxed him in on Route 68 with about 20 choppers. Mutt is too scared to run them over, and Dax is just 3 seconds away from driving a technical truck out there and starting a gang war. Naruto grinned with genuine amusement. After weeks of playing the terrifying, silent ghost in the shadows, dealing with a swarm of dusty bikers attempting to hijack an RV sounded surprisingly refreshing. "Tell Dax to stay in the freak shop," Naruto said, throwing his empty ramen cup into the trash. "I will handle the bikers." "Route 68 is all the way out in Sandy Shores," Amani warned, displaying a live satellite feed. "If you take the Buffalo, the bikers will shoot the tires out of the brickade before you even cross the county line." Naruto turned towards the secondary motor pool doors. "Who said I am taking the car?" 5 minutes later, the reinforced blast doors on the side of the Vinewood estate opened. Naruto sped out into the late afternoon sun on the back of the Oppressor Mk2. The hoverbike was a ridiculous, physics-defying technology. It had no wheels and relied solely on a massive rear jet turbine and localized anti-gravity thrusters to stay in the air. For anyone else, the lack of friction made it dangerously unstable at high speeds. However, for a shinobi who could actively channel chakra into the footpegs to anchor his center of gravity, it was an absolute dream. Naruto banked sharply, the thrusters screaming as he launched the bike off the edge of the Vinewood Hills and out over the sprawling Blaine County. He couldn't help but laugh as the wind blew through his hair. The sheer, blinding speed of the turbine engine that pushed him back into his seat was incredible. The smog of the city gave way to the dry, hot air of the desert, which smelled of baked sand and wild sagebrush. The Oppressor consumed miles of open airspace, allowing him to travel quickly. The heavily armored Brickade 6x6 swerved across Route 68's cracked asphalt. A swarm of 20 roaring motorcycles flanked it from all sides. The bikers were swinging heavy chains, shouting over the roar of their V-twin engines, and occasionally firing wild pistol shots at the Acid Lab's bulletproof tires. Naruto did not pull out a weapon. He did not unleash a wave of crushing, terrifying gravity. He simply smiled. He aimed the Oppressor at the convoy, cutting the jet turbine and allowing the bike to glide silently. He lowered the hoverbike so low that it was skimming the dust directly behind the last 2 bikers in the formation. Naruto stood on the hoverbike's footpegs, forming a cross-shaped hand seal and channeling his chakra. 4 shadow clones appeared in the turbulent air behind the motorcycles, accompanied by soft popping sounds. The first clone sat perfectly in the pillion seat behind a large, bearded biker. The biker felt a sudden weight on his suspension, and his eyes widened in the rearview mirror. The clone grinned and tapped the biker on the shoulder. "Your shoelaces are untied." The biker panicked and swerved violently to the right. The tires locked up, causing the motorcycle to slide into the soft sand of the desert shoulder. The biker landed safely in a patch of tumbleweeds amid a cloud of dust. The second clone snatched a red bandana from another biker in mid-ride. The sudden blinding rush of wind caused the biker to hit the brakes, resulting in a massive chain reaction. 3 more members of the Lost MC collided with the back of his bike, sending them all skidding off the asphalt and into a shallow drainage ditch. Naruto laughed and used the oppressor's thrusters to maneuver between the remaining choppers. The bikers appeared completely disoriented. They were expecting a shootout, not a swarm of grinning teenagers falling from the sky. One biker attempted to swing a heavy iron chain at Naruto as he passed by, but Naruto simply reached out and caught the end of it. With a gentle tug, he used the biker's own momentum to pull him from the saddle, allowing the riderless motorcycle to coast harmlessly into a cactus. Mutt, in the driver's seat of the Brickade, was hyperventilating and gripping the steering wheel tightly. He looked in the side mirror, and his jaw dropped. The terrifying swarm of the Lost MC was fading. Bikers were spinning out, getting into ditches, or having their keys snatched from their ignitions by impossible, multiplying teenagers. Naruto perfectly matched the speed of the massive RV as he glided the oppressor alongside its driver's window. He gave Mutt a bright 2-fingered salute. Naruto shouted happily, "Road's clear, Mutt." Despite the wind. "Hold it steady." Mutt's bewildered expression gave way to a massive grin. He honked the Acid Lab's heavy air horn in triumph and slammed his foot on the gas, speeding toward the safety of Los Santos city limits. As Naruto pulled back on the handlebars, the oppressor shot straight up into the warm desert sky. He didn't need to be a ghost or a terrifying mob boss today. Taking out the trash could sometimes be a lot of fun. The Murrieta oil fields stretched out into the hazy Los Santos night, a sprawling wasteland of dirt roads and heavy machinery, punctuated only by the constant, rhythmic pounding of the huge iron pump jacks. The air was thick and heavy, smelling heavily of raw crude oil, exhaust fumes, and the distant saltwater of the eastern seacoast. The Buffalo STX stopped silently behind a cluster of rusted, abandoned shipping containers near the edge of the active drilling zone. Naruto cut the ignition. There was a sudden silence in the armored cabin, soon to be broken by the mechanical groans of the oil field beyond. Amani unbuckled her seatbelt. Last year the FIB dumped 3 dozen decommissioned servers out here after the IAA raided their downtown offices. She reached for a heavy canvas tool roll from the center console. It's mostly stripped, but the central liquid cooling units are directly integrated into the chassis. Most scavengers don't have the time and the tools to cut them out. Naruto pushed his door open, stepping out into the oily dirt. He was in dark tactical pants and a plain black t-shirt, the cool night air doing nothing to cut the oppressive, greasy humidity of the basin. He didn't want to know the technical specifications. His master control terminal in the Vinewood bunker was overheating, and Amani needed a particular piece of hardware to stabilize his network. That was all the motivation he needed. Together they walked through the maze of rusted metal. The ground was slick with oil spills and crushed gravel. Amani moved with a quiet, practiced efficiency, her dark eyes scanning the serial numbers painted on the sides of the decaying containers. "Here," she whispered, standing in front of a container secured with a thick steel padlock. Naruto moved forward. He didn't pull out a kunai, or flare a huge wave of chakra. He just grabbed the big iron padlock with his bare hand and squeezed. The lock crumpled inward, with a protesting groan, then gave way completely, the hardened steel crumpling inward like dry clay. He opened the big iron doors. Inside the container it was pitch black and unbearably hot. A thick wave of fried silicon and stale dust rolled out of the air. Amani switched on a small, powerful tactical flashlight clipped to the shoulder of her jacket. The white beam cut through the darkness, revealing rows of gutted, towering server racks. The metal frames were stripped of their casings, left to rot, and were heavily rusted. She walked down the cramped narrow aisle and stopped near the back wall. "There it is," she said, kneeling in the dirt. Naruto came up right behind her. The racks were so close together that they had to stand shoulder to shoulder. He could smell the faint familiar scent of herbal tea and clean ozone clinging to her jacket, cutting right through the heavy stench of the oil field. Amani shone her light down into the bottom of the huge steel rack. A heavy, sleek aluminum cooling unit was screwed right to the foundation of the tower. "It's intact," Amani said, her voice all business as she unrolled her canvas toolkit. She scowled, peeling a sheet of thick rust off the main support strut of the server frame. "But the locking pins are all rusted. That whole stack is structurally unsound. If I try to pull the cooling unit loose, the torque will snap the bottom struts. I pull it and thousands of pounds of steel are going to come down." She looked around the narrow space, claustrophobic. If the huge tower fell, there was no getting round it. Naruto made no suggestion, no argument about the physics of the rotting metal. He just walked past her and wedged himself into the tight space. He braced his hands against the cold, rusted steel of the main support beams, bending his knees just a little to take his weight. "I got the stack," Naruto said, voice utterly calm, with that unnatural, heavy gravity to it. "Don't hurry." Amani looked up at him. She didn't ask if he was certain. She did not tell him of the immense crushing weight of the metal above them. Only the absolute, unshakable certainty of his posture registered, and all the tension bled from her shoulders. She slid easily onto her back and shimmied under the huge server rack between Naruto's boots. Naruto's grip tightened as Amani wedged a heavy titanium pry bar into the cooling unit's mounting bracket. She grunted with effort and pushed down. The bottom struts of the server tower snapped, and the rusted metal gave an agonizing crack. The entire stack plunged violently down. Naruto didn't even blink. The thousands of pounds of dead shifted their weight easily, the boots biting solidly into the dirt floor of the container. No muscle in his arm twitched. He held the huge steel structure hanging in the darkness with the utter stillness of a concrete pillar. Amani went on working under the suspended steel. She didn't dart away, didn't glance up to see if the roof was falling in. She was perfectly certain that he was real and physical. With a cool hand, she unfastened the last of the mounting clips and slid the heavy cooling unit out of the base. "Got it," she said, and slid out from under the rack, stood up and brushed the dirt off her jacket. Naruto waited until she was completely out of the aisle. He pulled the steel back and stepped away once she was clear of the container. The server rack slammed into the dirt with a deafening, metallic roar, throwing up a huge cloud of ancient dust. Naruto stepped out into the cool night air, wiping a streak of rust off his hands. Amani was at the Buffalo STX, hugging the heavy cooling unit into the trunk. She put the lid on and turned to him. The rhythmic, hard light of the oil derricks far away caught the faint, relaxed smile of her face. She opened the passenger door and said dryly, "You're a very efficient jack stand, Naruto." "Easy," sincere grin from Naruto as he rounded the hood to the driver's side. "I try to please. Now let's fix the network." The enormous, insulated cabin of the armored Enos Paragon R reeked of rich mahogany and expensive hand-stitched leather. Naruto drove with one hand casually on the wheel, the huge V12 engine purring silently beneath the hood as he took the winding descent from the Vinewood Hills down into the busy heart of East Vinewood. He was dressed in a black suit that fit him perfectly, the starched collar of the white dress shirt perfectly straight. A move that was needed. From the underground safe house to the neon-soaked luxury of the Diamond Casino. And sometimes, his deep, primal urge to hold on to his quiet ecosystem meant he had to step out of the shadows and remind the city who really owned the board. He drove the Paragon into the VIP underground garage, ignoring the valet line. Not making a sound on the polished marble floor, he made a beeline for the private elevator, his dress shoes silent. When the heavy doors swung open onto the high roller floor, the tension in the air was palpable. The smooth jazz and the clatter of the ringing slot machines were totally drowned out by a shrill, furious voice echoing from the private blackjack tables. Agatha Baker stood outside the velvet rope of the VIP lounge. Her perfect posture was rigid with tension, her hands gripping a digital tablet hard against her chest. Her skin was white, the dark circles under her eyes a stark contrast to her spotless business suit. Naruto came up to her, and the wild energy swirling around the entrance immediately zeroed in on him. "Agatha," he said softly. She flinched, then sighed a shuddering sigh of relief at the sight of him. "Naruto." Thank God. It was Julian Vance. A Silicon Valley tech venture capitalist. That's $4 million down the drain and he's just ripping up the floor. He just threw a crystal highball glass at one of my dealers. I can't call casino security to physically drag a billionaire out without a huge PR disaster, and he's threatening to buy the holding company just to fire everyone in the building. Naruto's bright blue eyes drifted over to the lounge. This man thought his bank account made him a god. He was a direct threat to his need for the diamond to be a quiet, profitable sanctuary. Stay here, Naruto said smoothly. He slipped through the velvet rope, into the lavish VIP lounge. The air tasted of spilled bourbon and expensive cigars and sharp, aggressive adrenaline. At the middle table, Julian Vance was looming over a petrified dealer. He was a red-faced man, in his late 40s, with a silk shirt unbuttoned to the chest. He was violently knocking stacks of $100,000 chips off the green felt, sending them crashing to the floor. "You're cheating, Vance," he yelled, his voice cracking with rage. "You know who I am? I have algorithms that could bankrupt your whole bloodline. I'll have this place leveled and turned into a parking lot." Naruto didn't shout. He didn't do any sort of signal to the security cameras, and he didn't reach for a weapon. He just walked to the edge of the blackjack table and stopped. He bled a localized wave of intensely concentrated pure, heavy chakra into the air. The temperature in the lounge dropped. The crushing weight of a real apex predator's suffocating squeeze hit Julian Vance like a physical wall. The billionaire's tirade died in his throat. All the color drained from his face, leaving it a sickly gray. His nervous system, used to the insulated safety of boardrooms and luxury yachts, suddenly screamed to him that he was in immediate, mortal danger. Slowly Vance turned his head, and his wide eyes, wide with terror, fixed on the teenager in the black suit. Naruto was standing with his hands in his pockets. He didn't seem angry. His total, emotionless calm was far more terrifying than rage. "You're done playing," Naruto said. His voice was low, but it resonated through the floorboards, carrying an unnatural gravity that seemed to suck the air right out of Vance's lungs. Vance gurgled, his legs trembling so wildly that he had to clutch the edge of the velvet table to keep himself from falling over. The size of the power imbalance ground his ego into dust in a blink of an eye. Naruto continued, his blue eyes holding the billionaire completely frozen. "You are going to cash out your remaining chips. You're going to walk out the front door. You're never coming back to this casino. You mention this building again in a boardroom, your money won't save you." Vance could not speak. He could not even nod his head. He gave a pathetic frantic whimper, and his hands shook as he blindly snatched a few chips off the floor. He staggered back, almost tripping over a velvet chair, then turned and practically ran from the lounge, ignoring his personal security detail completely. The pressure of the crush was gone from the room, and the warm air smelling of bourbon was back. The frightened dealer exhaled a huge, trembling breath, staring at Naruto in sheer awe. Naruto gave the man a brief nod, respectful, and turned back toward the entrance. Agatha was standing by the rope. All the frantic tension had gone out of her body. She had never felt so utterly safe in her life. Naruto had taken down a monster of the Vinewood High Society without lifting a finger or causing a public incident. "He's selling out," Naruto said easily, smoothing his cuffs. "The floor is quiet." Agatha turned. There was a small, genuine smile breaking through her professional mask. "Thanks, Naruto." The ecosystem's defenses had been tried, and the sanctuary remained untouched. Naruto's boots felt a constant vibration from the Buffalo STX's V8 engine, which was heavy and aggressive. He cruised north along the Great Ocean Highway, the dense, smog-choked air of Los Santos gradually giving way to the sharp, stinging scent of cold Pacific saltwater and damp coastal sage. Chumash, a cliffside community on the continent's edge, was a narrow strip of multi-million-dollar real estate suspended over crashing waves. Naruto parked the STX on an unlit shoulder a quarter-mile up the road from the target coordinates. Even from this distance, the rhythmic, throbbing bass of a high-end sound system reverberated on the asphalt. The mansion was a massive, modern fortress made of glass and white concrete, lit by harsh blue exterior lights. Dozens of luxury supercars were crammed into the driveway, and the terraces were packed with drunk Vinewood socialites, their loud, overlapping laughter drowning out the sound of the ocean. He didn't care about the party, music, or stolen unreleased tracks on the VIP's phone. But Franklin's Record Studios served as a public buffer, keeping high society noise away from the agency, while the agency protected the quiet of the Vinewood safe house. If this phone leaked, the chaos would eventually spread to his doorstep. As Naruto stepped out of the car, the cold ocean wind whipped at his dark jacket. He didn't approach the front gates. Private security officers with military haircuts, sharp suits, and coiled earpieces stood rigidly near the valet stand, closely monitoring the perimeter. Instead, Naruto walked to the edge of the highway, stepping over the guardrail and dropping onto the jagged, slippery rocks of the cliff face. The ocean's roar drowned out any sounds he made. He directed a steady, highly pressurized layer of chakra into the soles of his boots and walked up the sheer vertical drop. The freezing ocean spray coated his face as he avoided the illuminated security cameras, ascending the property's blind spot directly over the lethal drop into the water. He silently slipped over the thick glass railing on the third-floor balcony. The mansion's interior, heated and insulated, was a stark contrast to the cold and windy outside. The inside air smelled strongly of expensive cologne, spilled champagne, and the bitter tang of synthetic recreational chemicals. Naruto pressed his back against the hallway wall, his sensory perception expanding. His mind immediately mapped out the layout. The massive crowd was contained on the first and second floors. On the third floor, the heavy bass was muffled. Two private security contractors stood at the far end of the corridor, facing the master suite's heavy oak doors. They were relaxed, complaining in low voices about the annoying guests downstairs, completely unaware that the perimeter had been breached. Naruto did not break into a sprint. He moved the air, covering the length of the carpeted hallway in a fraction of a second. Naruto's palm struck the guard on the left solar plexus before they noticed the sudden shift in shadows. The strike did not break any bones, but it did remove every ounce of oxygen from the man's lungs, instantly short-circuiting his diaphragm. Naruto pivoted as the man collapsed, gasping silently for air. The second guard reached for the heavy pistol at his hip, his eyes wide. Naruto's hand snapped out, crushing the man's wrist with an immovable grip. Naruto used his other hand to deliver a razor-thin, localized chakra pulse to the nerve cluster on the guard's neck. The man's eyes rolled back, and his body became completely limp. Naruto grabbed him by the lapels of his suit and lowered him to the thick carpet with a single thud. The corridor was quiet again. Naruto entered the master suite after turning the brass door handle. The room was a disaster zone, with discarded designer clothes and half-empty liquor bottles. A black smartphone was sitting perfectly alone on a sleek glass coffee table, plugged into a portable charging bank. He slipped the device into his jacket's inside pocket. The leverage was secured. He did not stop to enjoy the ocean view from the penthouse or rifle through the room. He stepped back out onto the balcony, the cold wind hitting him again, and fell off the cliff into the darkness. The chaotic variable had been removed, leaving his ecosystem's structural piece completely intact. The Del Perro nightclub's main floor base thumped against the subterranean basement walls, exerting constant physical pressure. The air down here was aggressively chilled, smelling strongly of ozone, hot silicon, and the bitter black coffee on Paige Harris's desk. Naruto sat in a corner of the server room, arms crossed, staring at the red data lines reflected in Paige's glasses. He did not need to understand the complex algorithmic encryption she was using. His primary goal was for the club's financial wash to remain completely invisible to the federal agencies operating in the city. Paige was the architect of that invisibility, and the architect is currently extremely frustrated. Paige muttered, her fingers flying aggressively across the mechanical keyboard. She kept her gaze fixed on the monitors. The FIB updated its passive scanning protocols yesterday. My black box is deflecting them, but the physical hardware on the roof isn't in sync with the basement terminal. I have a 3-second latency gap. Naruto inhaled the chilly air. A 3-second pause in a digital money wash was sufficient for an automated federal algorithm to detect the entire operation. What do you need? Naruto inquired quietly, his voice cutting through the noise of the cooling fans. Paige paused typing and exhaled sharply, irritated. She leaned back in her heavy leather chair and ran a hand through her short dark hair. She despised relying on external variables, but the physical reality of the building was currently outperforming her digital abilities. I need to manually reset the primary and secondary telecom relays on the roof, Paige explained, her tone clipped and professional. But they must be executed simultaneously, within a 0.5-second window, while I initiate the reboot sequence from this terminal. If the timing is incorrect by even a fraction of a second, the network will completely lock us out. She looked at him, her dark eyes analytical. The relays are 60 feet apart. The maintenance crew cannot move that quickly. I need you on the roof. Naruto did not inquire about the margin of error. He simply nodded and turned toward the heavy steel security door. Tell me when you are ready. He did not take the freight elevator. He avoided the crowded, neon-lit VIP lounges and the suffocating heat of the dance floor by taking the concrete fire stairs 3 at a time. He pushed open the heavy roof access door, stepping out into the foggy, damp night air of Del Perro. The roof was a maze of massive HVAC units, ventilation ducts, and black cabling. The salty odor of the nearby Pacific Ocean was strong in the fog. He found the primary relay box, a heavy metal cabinet bolted to the southern parapet. The secondary box sat 60 feet away, separated by exposed ductwork and exhaust fans. He unlatched both metal panels to reveal the heavy red manual override switches. Naruto returned to the exact midpoint between the two boxes. He did not tense his muscles or take a sprinting stance. He simply allowed a steady, highly pressurized flow of chakra to bleed into his calves and boot soles. He tapped the communication unit in his ear. I am in position. Paige reached for the enter key in the cold basement. Starting reboot sequence. Now. Naruto disappeared. He displaced the foggy air, his boots striking the gravel roof with a sound like a falling leaf. He reached the primary relay and slammed the heavy red switch down. Without losing momentum, he pivoted, his chakra violently propelling him backward across the 60-foot gap. He cleared the ductwork in a single, impossible backward leap, striking the secondary switch exactly 0.3 seconds after the first. He landed softly on the gravel, perfectly still and breathing evenly. The static in his ear lasted for a long time. Paige announced, synchronization complete, through the earpiece. The sharp edge of frustration was completely gone, replaced by a quiet, profound respect. Latency is absolutely zero. The wash is completely sealed. Naruto closed the heavy metal panels and secured the latches. He walked back to the roof access door, the fog swirling softly around his shoulders. When he returned to the basement, Paige's monitors displayed a steady, pristine green instead of the harsh red data streams. She leaned back in her chair, holding a fresh cup of coffee in her hand. She didn't lavish praise or abandon her guarded demeanor, but as Naruto walked back into the cool room, she met his gaze. You move well, Paige said, taking a sip of her coffee. It was a simple statement of fact, based on the undeniable reality of what he had just accomplished for her network. You build good walls, Naruto said softly, leaning against the cold concrete. The nightclub maintained its structural integrity through efficiency and trust. The subterranean concrete cavern of the LS car meet in Cypress Flats vibrated with the deafening roar of revving engines. The air was thick and suffocating, smelling strongly of high-octane fuel, burned rubber, and sweet vape smoke. Naruto stood at the back of the warehouse, away from the central test track's pulsing strobe lights. Hao was wiping a speck of dust from the hood of a heavily modified, metallic purple prototype supercar with a microfiber cloth, his eyes practically beaming with pride. It's completely custom, Hao exclaimed over the heavy bass line of the overhead speakers, tapping the carbon fiber roof. Bespoke engine block and experimental suspension. It's too fast for the streets. I need someone with real reflexes to test it before I sell the blueprints. Heavy tires screeched near the loading bay, interrupting Naruto's response. 3 unmarked, matte black vans smashed through the VIP barricades and skidded to a stop on the polished concrete. A dozen men in tactical gear emerged, racking the slides of heavy assault rifles. The car meets ambient noise was quickly replaced by the terrified screams of fleeing drivers and a stampede for the emergency exits. Keys. Give me the keys to the prototype, Hao, or we will light up the entire garage, the lead smuggler bellowed as he approached the purple supercar. Hao did not freeze. Acting on his established street survival instincts, he slammed his fist into the emergency wall panel, lowering the heavy steel lockdown shutters over the exit ramps, trapping the vans inside and sealing the neutral zone. Naruto stepped in front of the vehicle. His competing desires collided instantly. The fundamental need to keep Cypress Flats as a safe, profitable hub for his automotive fronts, and the immediate, sharp desire not to let a single stray bullet scratch Hao's masterpiece. He did not use a weapon or unleash a powerful wave of destructive chakra. This would ruin the paint. Instead, Naruto displaced air. He moved with intense, localized pressure, crossing the concrete floor before the lead smuggler could align his iron sights. Naruto's palm struck the man's sternum with blunt, highly controlled force, knocking the breath from his lungs and sending him crashing into the side of the van. Two smugglers swung their rifles towards him. Naruto ducked under the barrels, smelling the gun oil and nervous sweat emanating from them. He swept their legs out from under them with a precise kick, catching their weapons' heavy steel barrels as they fell and twisting them out of their grasp with a sharp crack of fractured metal. He moved like a ghost through the remaining crew, neutralizing them with precise, non-lethal strikes on nerve clusters and joints. He used their own momentum against them, throwing one thug into another to keep their bodies on a chaotic trajectory away from the prototype vehicle. Within 30 seconds, 12 heavily armed men were groaning on the cold, oil-stained concrete. Not a single shot was fired. Hao emerged from behind a concrete pillar with a loud, adrenaline-fueled laugh. He looked at the spotless supercar, then at the pile of unconscious bodies. Hao shook his head and tossed the keys to Naruto. "You clearly have the reflexes. Track is yours." The Del Perro nightclub basement was constantly vibrated by bass from the dance floor above. It shook the empty coffee mugs on Paige's desk and vibrated Naruto's boots as he leaned against the cold concrete wall. The server room's air was cold and smelled like burnt espresso and dry ozone. Suddenly, the heavy thumping overhead ceased. The silence was abrupt and unnatural. A split second later, the basement's harsh fluorescent lights flickered and died, leaving the room completely dark. The mechanical hum of the massive cooling fans came to a halt. The red emergency lights on the ceiling created long, sharp shadows on the metal server racks. Paige did not gasp or freeze. Her hands flew over her mechanical keyboard, and her dark eyes reflected the crimson light. "The mainline power grid has been cut," she said, her voice tight but professional. "Someone just cut the external junction box on the street. The backup generators are not kicking in." Naruto pushed off the wall. His sensory perception expanded outward, instantly mapping the physical reality of the structure. The chaotic energy of the panicked clubgoers upstairs was thick, but 8 distinct, heavy presences moved with highly disciplined, tactical precision through the loading bay below it. They were not members of any local gangs. They moved like soldiers. "Merryweather," Naruto said quietly. His fundamental desire to keep this sanctuary, the absolute core of his financial ecosystem, honed into a cold, hard focus. He moved across the room and stopped in front of Paige's terminal. "Move behind the primary server stack. Don't move." Paige did not argue. The sheer, unnatural gravity that emanated from him left no room for debate. She took her encrypted master drive, ripped it from its port, and slid into the narrow, dark space between the heavy steel racks. The basement security door's reinforced steel began to hiss. The sharp, blinding white spark of a thermal breaching torch pierced the heavy lock mechanism, filling the chilled air with the suffocating odor of vaporized copper and molten iron. Naruto stood in the center of the room, his hands relaxed at his sides. He didn't assume a combat stance. The door shattered with a loud crash as it was kicked open. 4 mercenaries wearing heavy tactical body armor entered the room, sweeping the aisles with the blinding beams of their weapon-mounted flashlights. "Clear drives. Check the corners," the lead mercenary barked, his voice muffled by a heavy ballistic mask. Naruto prevented them from establishing a perimeter. He displaced the air. The strobe of the flashlights made him move too quickly for the human eye to process. He materialized right inside the guard of the lead mercenary. Naruto's palm landed on the heavy ceramic plating of the man's chest rig. He did not shatter the armor. Instead, he drove a blunt, highly pressurized pulse of kinetic force straight through it. The mercenary's ribs groaned and oxygen left his lungs as he was thrown backward into the concrete hallway. He was unconscious before hitting the floor. The second man swung his rifle wildly at the movement. Naruto's hand snapped out, gripping the hot steel of the barrel. With a sharp, agonizing twist of his wrist, Naruto snapped the weapon in half, shattering the firing pin and upper receiver into useless metal fragments. He moved inside the man's frantic swing, landing a precise strike on the nerve cluster at the base of his neck. The mercenary collapsed, leaving a heap of heavy Kevlar. Paige, positioned between the cold steel racks, witnessed the chaos unfold. The oppressive fear of being trapped in a concrete box with a private military hit squad was completely absent. Her nervous system, which is typically wired for constant vigilance and distrust, was completely relaxed. She remained silent as Naruto dismantled the last two operatives. He did not use explosive or destructive power that could harm her hardware. He used absolute and terrifying precision. He grabbed a swinging combat knife by the wrist and used the attacker's momentum to push them face first into the concrete wall. It ended in less than 10 seconds. The room fell silent again, except for the groans of the unconscious men and the sharp crackle of the broken locking mechanism. The odor of cordite and sweat hung heavy in the cold air. Naruto stood among the bodies, with the harsh red emergency lights catching the sharp angles of his face. His breathing was completely even. He did not look at the downed mercenaries or check the doorway for reinforcements. He turned around and searched for Paige in the dark corner. "Are you hurt?" Naruto inquired softly, the heavy, suffocating pressure of his murderous intent instantly leaving the room. Paige slowly emerged from behind the rack. She looked at the shattered steel of the door, then back at him. She noticed a slight tension in his shoulders, not from the exertion of the fight, but from the urgent need to ensure her physical safety. He had prioritized her reality above all else in the room. She felt a deep shift in her chest. It wasn't the frantic adrenaline of survival. It was the quiet, unmistakable realization of absolute safety. "I'm fine," Paige said, her voice losing its sharp, guarded edge. She slipped the encrypted drive inside her leather jacket. "The hardware is secured." Naruto nodded briefly before returning his attention to the ruined hallway. The external threat had been neutralized, and the ecosystem's internal trust had been permanently reinforced. Route 68's cracked asphalt reflected the harsh, blinding heat of the Grand Senora Desert, creating a distorted horizon. The air out here was suffocating, smelling of baked sand, sulfur from the Alamo Sea, and the acrid, chemical stench of burned rubber. Naruto banked the oppressor Mk2 sharply over the jagged peaks of the Sanchiansky mountain range, the jet turbine whining as he reduced his altitude. The freak shop beneath him was under siege. A disorganized coalition of rival desert cartels and heavily armed scavengers pushed into Fooligan's territory, aiming to seize the lucrative acid lab. 3 armored technical trucks equipped with heavy machine guns surrounded the scrapyard, pouring a deafening barrage of lead into the rusted corrugated steel walls. Inside the compound, Dax fought like a cornered animal. "Hold the line. Don't let these filthy scavengers touch my vats." Dax's voice boomed above the deafening crack of automatic gunfire. He was pinned behind a stack of hollowed-out bus frames, his face drenched in sweat, desperately slamming a new magazine into his rifle. Naruto did not land his hoverbike in the center of the compound to signal his arrival. His fundamental desire was straightforward. The Fooligans served as a loud, chaotic buffer, keeping the desert's violent variables separate from his own peaceful ecosystem in Los Santos. He needed Dax to maintain complete control over sandy shores, and a leader can only maintain control if his people believe he won the war. After cutting the oppressor's engine, Naruto glided silently onto the rusted roof of an abandoned gas station overlooking the scrapyard. His sensory perception immediately mapped the chaotic battlefield. The Fooligans had the numbers, but they were being systematically suppressed by a sniper perched on a distant water tower, while technical trucks tore their cover apart. Naruto dropped through the open skylight of the gas station, his boots hitting the dusty concrete silently. He did not draw his weapon. He displaced the air. He quickly made his way to the base of the water tower, avoiding the chaotic crossfire. He climbed the rusted iron ladder, the metal groaning softly beneath his grasp. At the top, the cartel sniper peered through his scope, his finger tightening on the trigger as he lined up a perfect shot on Dax's exposed shoulder. Naruto gripped the back of the man's neck. A razor-thin pulse of chakra struck the nerve cluster, causing the sniper to collapse into a heap of dead weight before firing the rifle. Down in the dirt, Dax felt the oppressive sniper fire stop. He had no idea why the high-caliber rounds had stopped hitting the ground around his boots, but his survival instincts seized the opportunity. "Now, push them back," Dax bellowed, leaping over the rusted bus frame. He fired wildly, his adrenaline propelling him directly into the open. One of the heavy technical trucks swerved, swinging its heavy machine gun directly at Dax. Naruto flicked his wrist from the water tower's shadows. He did not unleash a massive, devastating hurricane. He unleashed a concentrated, localized blade of wind chakra that glided flawlessly across the desert floor. It sliced cleanly through the technical truck's front passenger tire. The heavy tire exploded with a concussive bang. The truck lurched violently, and the steering column locked up as the rim dug into the soft sand. The gunner was thrown off balance, his barrage of bullets firing harmlessly into the sky as the vehicle collided with a concrete barrier. "Eat it, you bottom feeders!" Dax screamed, completely unaware of the invisible wind. He removed a heavy grenade from his tactical vest, pulled the pin with his teeth, and hurled it perfectly into the bed of the crashed truck. An explosion rocked the scrapyard, spewing black smoke and twisted metal into the hot desert sky. The remaining cartel members panicked after their heavy support was destroyed and their sniper went silent. Their uncoordinated lines failed, and they scrambled back to their dirt bikes and dune buggies, fleeing into the hazy dunes. The deafening roar of gunfire faded, leaving only the desert's silence and the crackle of burning gasoline. Dax stood in the center of the scrapyard, breathing heavily, the scorching sun beating down on his shoulders. He returned his attention to his cheering crowd after looking at the retreating dust trails. He raised his rifle high in the air, letting out a wild, triumphant laugh. Naruto sat in the shade of the water tower, his tongue coated in dry dust. He did not come out to claim credit. The perimeter was secure, the buffer zone remained intact, and the Fooligans owned the entire desert. The scorching heat of East Los Santos made the Murrieta train yard feel like an oven, with narrow gaps between rusted freight cars. The air tasted heavy and thick, with the sharp sting of diesel exhaust, hot iron, and baked grease. Franklin Clinton pressed his back against the peeling paint of a massive tanker car, breathing sharply and heavily. His tailored suit jacket was ruined, stained with industrial dust and a smear of dark oil. He ejected the spent magazine from his heavy pistol, the empty metal clattering against the gravel, before slamming a new clip into the grip. A rogue squad of professional fixers, hired by a desperate Vinewood executive attempting to burn down the agency, cornered him during a routine property inspection. They had the numbers, the high-caliber rifles, and a strong desire to collect the bounty on his head. Clinton echoed aggressively through the canyon of train cars, distorted by massive corrugated steel walls. "There's nowhere else to run, man. The yard is locked down. Step out, and we'll make it quick." Franklin wiped sweat from his forehead. He did not need to be rescued. He needed to permanently resolve this issue, and he needed the city to understand that the agency's leader could not be pursued on his own streets. The air above the gravel tracks was surprisingly cool, despite the oppressive heat. Naruto sat perfectly balanced on the yellow steel scaffolding of a massive loading crane, 50 feet up. The oppressor MKII's jet turbine was cooling down on the flat roof of a nearby warehouse. His sensory perception easily penetrated the thick steel of the train cars. He tracked Franklin's intense, adrenaline-fueled presence, which was surrounded by 6 armed fixers. 2 mercenaries were scaling the ladders of the adjacent boxcars, hoping to establish a lethal crossfire from the high ground. Naruto did not approach Franklin from the gravel. The agency belonged to Franklin. If the city thought a teenager in a hoodie was the real muscle, Franklin's hard-earned authority would vanish. Naruto's primary goal was to maintain the buffer that kept his own life quiet. He displaced air. He appeared behind the first fixer, just as the man climbed onto the roof of the boxcar. The mercenary's combat boots had barely touched the hot, rusted steel when Naruto's palm hit the base of his spine. A concentrated burst of kinetic chakra paralyzed the man's central nervous system. He collapsed silently onto the roof, completely immobilized before he could take a breath. The second sniper on a parallel train car dropped to one knee and raised his rifle, peering through the scope. Naruto did not jump the gap. He flicked his wrist after channeling a razor-thin current of wind chakra into his fingertips. The compressed blade of air moved silently across the distance, striking the metal receiver of the sniper's rifle. The heavy weapon shattered in the man's hands with a dull crack, knocking him backward off the edge of the train car and into a pile of discarded wooden pallets with a heavy thud. Franklin was down in the gravel when he heard the distant crash of the falling sniper. He didn't understand the exact physics of what was going on above him, but his survival instincts detected the sudden, gaping hole in the enemy's perimeter. The high ground was clear. "My turn," Franklin muttered angrily. He emerged from behind the tanker car, exposing himself in the narrow alley. The lead fixer, startled by the sound of his fallen comrade, swung his rifle a fraction of a second too late. Franklin fired 3 rounds. The loud roar of the heavy pistol reverberated violently throughout the yard. The lead fixer collapsed instantly, his armor unable to withstand the close-range impact. The remaining 3 mercenaries broke their coordinated formation, panicking as their advantage dwindled. One attempted to fire blindly around the corner of a flatbed, but Franklin was already moving, driving the action forward with unwavering, practiced aggression. He closed the gap, kicking the man's rifle barrel into the dirt and landing a brutal right hook that sent the fixer crashing into the gravel. The final 2 men left without fighting. Their nerves completely shattered, they dropped their weapons and dashed toward the chain-link perimeter fence, desperate to escape the yard. Franklin stood in the middle of the tracks, feeling the oppressive heat on his shoulders. The air was thick with the aroma of cordite and hot brass. He holstered his weapon and exhaled slowly, letting go of the crushing tension in his spine. Naruto sat in the crane operator cabin's deep shadow, watching the remaining fixers scramble over the fence and disappear into the industrial sprawl. He didn't give a nod or walk out into the sunlight. The threat was neutralized immediately. Franklin had held his ground, driving the violent variables completely out of his territory, while the ecosystem remained intact. Stay tuned for more. Thank you for taking the time to listen to this video. I'm thrilled you watched the video. If you enjoyed it, be sure to like and subscribe for even more exciting content coming your way soon.